Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, Agape Conversations with Agape. Today, I'm joined with Pauline Meert. You may recognize the last name, daughter of Christian and Christine Meert, who are the founders of Agape Catholic Ministries. Pauline, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be able to talk to people and hopefully offer some helpful tools and resources. So,
Absolutely. We can't wait to hear it. And right now, everyone is in listen only mode. You will have the opportunity to ask Pauline a question during the last 5 to 10 minutes of this session. But I will turn off my video, Pauline, and I'll let you take it away and I'll turn it back on during that question and answer time. Okay? Thank you again for being here.
yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for to all who are joining. It's a joy to get to chat with you. I got to come on a little while back and chat a little bit about Montessori education. So, my background is in Montessori education. I've actually done it half my life. So, I started learning about Montessori when I was 18 years old and been doing it for 18 years. So, it's just obviously a very big part of my life. I'm the one of the co-founders of Sophia Montessori Academy in Denver, Colorado, and we are an independent Catholic school in the Byzantine Catholic tradition and on day 3 of the new school year. So, woo, it's been a lot and it's been wonderful. Just such a joy to get to see the children in the classrooms and in the hallways and get to spend time with the parents. So, very, very wonderful time of the year. So, yeah, so one of the things I wanted to share with you guys about is what Maria Montessori shares about development. So she splits development into what she called the 4 planes of development. And a little bit of background, super quick, because the trickiest part for me is going to be to keep it short, because there's so much I could talk about. So Maria Montessori was the first modern female doctor in Italy in the late 1800s. And through her work with children who had disabilities, she started bringing in hands-on materials and found that children with disabilities needed it, but so do all children. So all children learn well with hands-on materials and an approach based on their development at that time. So that's kind of what I want to focus on today. So the 4 planes of development is how she splits up the different age groups from birth to age 24. And the cool thing to think about is how research now shows that it's not until after 24 that the brain development slows down, or you know what I mean, hopefully. Um, so it's really cool to see how current science and current research is proving a lot of Maria Montessori's points. So I'll give a quick outline on what those 4 planes are and how that can really impact how you parent, and how you best meet children's needs. So the first plane is from birth to age 6. So the first plane is very critical. It's a time full of learning, full of growth, and the biggest cry for help, so to speak, the biggest goal of that plane is help me to do it myself, physical independence. So we see it from a young baby trying to learning to lift their head, to learning to crawl, to learning to walk. As they get older, learning how to zip their zippers on their own, put their shoes on by themselves, help with different chores around the house, cook, run, play, all of that. The second plane of development, 6 to 12, is going to be an intellectual independence. So it's the cry for help me to think for myself. And there's a lot there with learning about virtues, about what's right, what's wrong, what's fair, what's unfair, being able to think more abstractly. So they still need a lot of the hands-on materials, but they're able to do a lot more in their head, not just with those tools. And then 12 to 18 is going to be a social independence. Who am I within my peers? And how am I different than my peers? How am I the same as my peers? And how do I, interact with my community? And then 18 to 24 is going to be a spiritual independence. Ideally, having gone through all these planes somewhat successfully, how do I give back to the world? How do I become a saint? How do I pray? What is my relationship with Christ and with others and the whole world? So that's the brief overview. So knowing these things can really help us understand what our children's needs are, and how to meet them. For example, when you have a 4-year-old, you're not going to give them, you shouldn't ask them as like, well, do you think this is fair or not? Right? You're like, no, this is going to be for the next plane of development, right? Right now, you just need to be able to physically do things. It's not my best example. I'll keep finding some better ones, but um, I'll go a little bit more in depth into each plane. But so the key to those planes of development is, one, to help us as adults know what their goals are. So by knowing what their goals are, we can modify how we approach the children and what activities and what um, games and tools and resources we can offer them. It can also be super helpful when you have a family with children in different ages, right? Because if you have, two children in the first plane of development, they might butt heads with, the two children in the second plane of development because their needs are different, and they might not understand each other as well as they used to when they were in the same plane of development. So that's something that I have found to be incredibly helpful to parents, to know that, oh, my 14-year-old is going to really struggle with my 10-year-old because their goals are so different. And but you're like, but 2 years before, they were great pals, and that's because they were in the same plane. They had similar goals. So to be able to notice that, I highly recommend for parents to take time to observe. So take time to step back and think about this very basic outline and just see, what is my child's cry for help right now? Is it physical independence? Is it social independence? Is it intellectual independence? And how can I change up things at home in the environment, change up expectations to really allow myself to meet those needs, and not just butt heads, because it can be so easy for us to just butt heads, to be like, come on, you were doing this just fine before, like, or have expectations that are just not realistic to that age group, such as, asking a 4-year-old to know exactly what's fair and what's unfair or what's virtuous. That's not going to work. But asking an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, that becomes much more appropriate, with the ideal that we've built up the skills for them to get there. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I'll spend a little bit more time on each plane of development. So the first plane is my personal expertise, 0 to 6, and Maria Montessori explained how there are two parts to it. The first part is the unconscious, 0 to 3, and then 3 to 6 is the conscious stage. So the first stage, 0 to 3, is everything is mostly done out of impulse. And the 3 cutoff is a little bit, it fluctuates between children, but that's, the generalization. So everything is done out of impulse, out of an urge to learn, to grow, to test things out. But it's not necessarily going to be a deeply thought out process of, well, I noticed that when I drop my ball, it makes mom really angry, so I'm going to do it again, right? It's like the impulse to see what happens when you drop the ball from, a changing table or a high chair and things like that. It's all about, oh, I need to see this, and I need to see it again and again and again. This is when really everything is being absorbed into the mind. Maria Montessori calls that the time of the absorbent mind, until about age 6, sometimes a little bit later as well. So this is really, again, 0 to 3 is, they're just taking everything in, and they're just interacting with their environment, and figuring out who they are, how to move, and all of that. So then 3 to 6, they become a little bit more conscious. So they start to realize they're more separate from other people. That's not really a part of that first plane of development. They start to recognize that they have choices, and that they can, take big action on these choices. And sometimes, people are like, oh, terrible 2s. I'm like, actually 3 tends to be a little bit harder, because they're more conscious. They're more aware of how their choices affect other people. And then they're going to keep trying it to see where those boundaries are, which can be a very difficult and trying time for the adults. But when we know that this is part of their need, part of what they have to go through to be able to know what the boundaries are, then hopefully it gives us a little bit more patience and gentleness in our interactions and understanding. So during that time period as well, of 0 to 6, the children also go through what Montessori called sensitive periods. So sensitive periods are going to be times that children are particularly sensitive to something, such as small objects. So you'll see 18-month-olds on the carpet picking out the tiniest little speck. That's a sensitive, something they're sensitive to. That's part of their formation in that plane of development. You'll see sensitive periods to what we call grace and courtesy, how to be with other people, to math and language. And actually, math and language are fascinating because often they'll go through, if they're in the sensitive period for math, they'll be super fascinated with numbers and all of that. They might not be with language. They can't usually be fascinated by both at the same time. So you're like, oh no, they don't want to read. They hate reading. I'm like, no, they're just, it's part of the development, it's part of the process. And vice versa, right? Of just like, oh no, they hate math. They don't never want to do it. I'm like, they'll never learn their numbers. It's like, no, right now they're focusing on language. So kind of being able to help us guide our observations and making sure that that light does end up shining on math or on language as they go through those sensitive periods. So again, a very rich time. A quick note is how if a child doesn't have any language during that time period, during that sensitive period, they most likely won't be able to speak or communicate because of the absorbent mind, because of that sensitivity. So being able to really offer them richness in their environment and great language is a fun little tip for that first plane of development. So ideally, we go through each plane somewhat successfully, and by successfully, I mean most of our needs are met. Obviously, we don't live in a perfect world. We all have, all parents do the best they can, and all of us children have our own experiences. But ideally, having a successful first period allows a plane of development, allows for a successful second plane of development. So during that time, you'll see children who really need to interact with their peers. They'll be far more interested in each other. In that first plane, they'll do more parallel play. They'll be next to each other. They'll interact and they love each other and they're very close friends as well. But it's really more of about their own independent development of me, my body, how I interact with the world. And that's okay. They're meant to be very selfish and self-centered at that age, right? But we want to make sure we guide them through those planes of development so they don't stay there. So that second plane, we're learning to think independently, right? We're learning, we want more knowledge. They want to do research. They're learning how to read. They're learning how to write. They're asking big questions. And some of those big questions are what's right, what's wrong, what's fair, what's unfair. This is the perfect time for virtues. It's the perfect time for fairy tales. So Montessori really saw how in the second plane of development, the children are able to think abstractly and differentiate really well between starting to differentiate really well between what's real and what's not real. And it really opens up their world to be able to receive fairy tales and be like, oh, there's a virtue there. There's a message. I can relate to it. I can connect. I've had this experience with a friend and or with a sibling, those kinds of things. So that's really, and again, a lot of times this is when a lot of the sacraments come into play. For us Byzantine children receive sacraments early on, but first confession tends to happen around that time, or around 6, 7, and sometimes a little bit later, depending on when the child is ready. But in Roman Catholic, then that's when you have preparation for First Holy Communion and in some dioceses confirmation. Anyway, I digress. But yeah, so just being able to offer them an environment that's very rich in knowledge, very rich in ways to think and how to think and asking big questions. And again, the second plane child might get very frustrated with the first plane child because they're like, I already know this. Like, I want more. I want deeper. I want to think abstractly. You're still stuck in like having to touch everything. So just a little note on that. And then again, offering them lots of opportunities to learn how to communicate with their peers and to learn how to, problem solve the bigger, more abstract things such as, hey, please don't do that. Like, or it hurts me if you do this. Obviously, we start presenting that to the young child of the first plane of development, but it's really going to be in that second plane of development where we can go to a deeper level. And again, back to those virtues. And then the third plane of development, I think, is very, very often misunderstood. It's that social independence, 12 to 18. And it's still very similar to the first plane of development. There's a lot of changes in the body, and they need a lot of physical work and a lot of movement, which we don't really give to teens outside of sports. And but yeah, so now they're trying to figure out, okay, I know how to move, I know how to think. How do I interact with not just my peers, but my wider community? And what is my identity outside of my family? So this is the time where we want to be very present to them and very accessible to them, while also recognizing that they need their peers, because they're comparing themselves a lot of like, if you do it this way, is that my guidebook? Is that what I need to do as well? So making sure that parents are very accessible to be like, hey, we can talk, while also offering a lot of freedom to be independent in interacting with their social sphere, which is easier said than done. But yeah, so they're really going to try to see, who am I? How do I give back? And so many saints, are in that third plane of development and second plane of development of like 12 to 18. You really start to see that fire, and it's 18 to 24 as you really see that fire, not just for the current social sphere, but for the whole world, right? And for that spiritual independence of, how do I love God and give back? And then, yeah, so for teens, we need to give them a lot of movement, a lot of freedom within boundaries. Again, I would need another hour just to talk about teens and just how incredible they are. This is when they start to see what's wrong with the world and how they want to change it. And often, they're just squished down, or they're not given an environment that has healthy values and morals, or they haven't experienced that in the second plane of development when they were 6 to 12, of like, no, there are values, there are virtues, there is right, there's wrong. So we want them to know this in that second plane, so that in the third plane, they can really see how that impacts their world, their community, and themselves, obviously. And again, that the third plane child might get very frustrated with the second plane child, because their needs are different, their focuses are different. And even though there are those frustrations, it's okay to have conversations with children from different planes, in the sense of, your brother's need right now is this, which might be hard for you because that's not your need anymore. So how do we collaborate together? How do we work together? And then back to that fourth plane of just, again, entering adulthood, seeing how each of these planes has gone through, hopefully as successfully as possible, to be able to give back to the world and really thrive and seek holiness. So yeah, so what do we do as adults with that information, right? Like I said a little bit earlier, focusing on observation, like, what is the need? Having meetings as a family, talking about it, being able to say, hey, I noticed, or I observed that you get really frustrated with sibling number 2. And I wonder if it's because of this. Can you tell me more about that? And, so those kinds of things for sibling relationships. But outside of sibling relationships, it can also be, oh, you're 5 and you're working on physical independence. At the end of the school day, you're going to be very tired. What you're going to need is to run. You're going to need to run to play, and just have some downtime to just release everything through your body. And then, but maybe if you're 11, you might actually just need a book and quiet time to just read and learn and focus on knowledge, because that's more what your body needs. Obviously, temperaments and personalities will make a difference in that as well. But just being able for us to know that as we grow and mature, there are steps, what feels like steps forward and steps back, but how it all goes back to our needs at that time. Yeah, and then, it can really help us as adults guide our expectations. So expecting, a 10-year-old to be very good in a social situation might be a little too much, right? Because they're still working on their own close knit. They might not be ready for a big social event, and those kinds of things. Going to the market, going to church, going to a friend's house. Um, when you have this information about each plane of development, it can really guide those expectations. So, for example, first plane of development involve them physically, right? If you're at the market, or at the grocery store, having them help pick out things. In the second plane of development, help them make the list, have them help make the list of thinking of like, ooh, is this the right food for me or not? The third plane of development, maybe start having them take on the responsibility. Okay, you're in charge of those things. You're going to be in charge of cooking, right? Kind of just taking it one step at a time, based on that. Another big one is church. What are our expectations in church? Is it fair to expect a 2-year-old to sit still? It's not. Even a 5-year-old is going to have a hard time sitting still. So how do we involve them? For the first plane of development, I recommend a lot of practice because they need to do things again and again. So going into the church when it's not Sunday and just practicing. It's like, this is how we stand. This is how we kneel. This is how we make the sign of the cross. And then, because then that offers them the practice so that their bodies know what to do in church. The 6 to 12-year-olds ideally know how to use their body in church and can now think about it in a different way. Like, what did you hear Father say in the homily? In this hymn, what do you think it's trying to tell us? Like connecting it back to how to think about church and the virtues and again, that growth within the sacraments. And then, so then ideally by then they should be able to sit still, right? And then 12 to 18, how do you take this love that God has given you in the Eucharist and share it with your community? How do you go out? So I hope that that's something that can also help guide pastors, and like what to expect and how to share with your community and with your parishes, what each age range should be able to accomplish at what time. So 2-year-olds, they're going to need to walk back and forth. That's going to happen, and that's okay because they're learning. But should a 12-year-old? No, not so much. A 12-year-old should have mastered the ability to sit and to and again, this is broad, and to be able to pray. But now they can think about it. They can listen to the word before. They can talk about it after. They can, maybe having a journal to write down what they hear in the homily can be a really helpful tool. I still do this myself. I just have my little journal and I write down what our priest, Father Joel, says in the homily, and it just helps my own development and growth. But yeah, so being able to really support children in each plane is going to look different. And of course, I'm more than happy to chat with anybody who has questions. You're always welcome to send me an email and be like, wait, you said this. Can you explain it a little bit more? That's one of the big parts of the vision and mission of our school, Sophia Montessori Academy, is to share that light that Montessori outlined of how God placed development, how God made us, and to support families and parents and pastors and whoever else may need the help. So I'll stop there for now, to see if we have any questions or anything like that. But I could talk about this for a lot longer, but I think this is a pretty decent summary to kind of get you started. And don't hesitate to look up online more details on the planes of development. I did an hour-long episode with families of character on the 4 planes of development that I hope can help you, because I do go a little bit deeper. And yeah, just don't hesitate to reach out. I hope this helps.